It was a late evening in London, and the chill of early winter hung in the air. The grand ballroom of the Beaumont estate glowed with golden chandeliers, casting light over polished marble floors and decadent tapestries that adorned the walls. The guests, a gathering of the city's elite, danced and conversed, oblivious to the dark shadow that loomed just beneath the surface. No one could have predicted that this night, filled with laughter and elegance, would soon be stained with tragedy. A scream echoed through the ballroom. It was high-pitched and full of terror, drawing the attention of every guest in the room. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Conversations halted, glasses were dropped, and the music ceased. All eyes turned toward the source of the scream, a large velvet curtain at the far side of the room, now trembling as though stirred by an unseen hand. Before anyone could react, a figure stepped from behind the curtain. It was a young woman, her face ashen, her eyes wide with horror. She staggered forward, her hands outstretched as if trying to ward off something unseen. Behind her, obscured by the folds of the curtain, lay a body, a man, his face twisted in pain and terror, his life stolen in an instant. "The Duke! He's dead!" the woman gasped, her voice trembling. The guests rushed forward, a mixture of shock and disbelief. The Duke of Morville, a wealthy aristocrat known for his charm and influence, lay lifeless, his once pristine suit now stained with blood. It was clear the Duke had not died in some tragic accident. No, his death had been deliberate. Someone had planned this murder. But who? And more importantly, why? The room buzzed with whispers. The guests, each with their own secrets and hidden motives, began to murmur nervously. No one dared approach the body, and yet no one could stop staring at it, caught in the gruesome tableau of death and mystery. The curtain, which had concealed the truth, now seemed to mock them. It was a simple piece of cloth, but it had hidden everything, and in the end, it revealed nothing. It was then that the door to the ballroom creaked open, and a figure entered, small in stature, but with an air of quiet authority that seemed to settle over the room like a shroud. The man's name was known to all, though none had seen him in many months. Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective. The guests parted instinctively, creating a path for the man with the most revered mind in Europe. Poirot's polished black shoes clicked lightly on the marble floor as he walked forward, his sharp eyes scanning the room. His presence was calm, almost serene, in stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. As he neared the body, Poirot paused and adjusted his gloves with the precision of a man who believed that even the smallest detail held significance. His mustache twitched slightly, a telltale sign of his concentration. He had not yet spoken a word, but already his very demeanor seemed to fill the room with a sense of order. "The curtain," he murmured, almost to himself. "It conceals so much, but it also hides nothing." A hushed silence fell over the gathering. Poirot's words were cryptic, but there was no mistaking the weight they carried. He stepped forward, examining the scene with the intense focus only he could muster. His mind, already active and calculating, was beginning to piece together the puzzle. But, like the curtain itself, it was clear that this mystery would not be so easily unveiled. As Poirot surveyed the room, his gaze moved over the faces of the guests. They, too, seemed to hold something back, their expressions betraying unease and guilt. There were many who had motives, each more tangled than the last, but Poirot would not be swayed by first impressions or half-truth. No, he would wait, watching, waiting, until the full picture began to take shape. The truth was there, hidden behind layers of deception, and it was up to him to peel them away, one by one. The ballroom, once filled with the music of a string quartet, now buzzed with nervous energy. The grand chandelier above cast flickering shadows, as if reluctant to cast light on the dark mystery at hand. The guests, now in clusters, whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of curiosity, fear, and concealed anxiety. None dared approach the body, their gazes lingering on the lifeless figure of the Duke, who had been the center of so much admiration and scandal in equal measure. Poirot stood quietly by the body, observing everything and yet saying nothing. His sharp eyes darted from one guest to the next, silently assessing the room's occupants. His presence was commanding, yet there was a calmness to him that seemed to settle the anxiety in the room, even if only momentarily. Among the gathered crowd, the first person to step forward was Lady Margaret Thornton, a widow of significant wealth and impeccable social standing. Her sharp, calculating eyes met Poirot's, though she did not speak. A woman of mystery and discretion, she had often been at the heart of London's high society, involved in many whispered affairs. Some innocent, others less so. Her gaze flickered toward the curtain, and then back to the Duke's body, her lips pressed tightly together, a look of distress painting her features. Poirot noted this. Beside her stood her niece, Clara Williams, a striking woman in her late 20s with golden locks and eyes that seemed to hide far more than they revealed. Clara was the epitome of a debutante. Beautiful, poised, and adept at hiding any emotional unrest beneath a composed surface. Yet there was something about her that seemed off. She fidgeted with her gloves, her fingers twitching nervously as her gaze never once met Poirot's. Poirot's mind was already working, forming a list of possible motivations and means. Lady Margaret, with her carefully curated reputation, would certainly have her own reasons to distance herself from the Duke's death. And Clara, her niece, likely sought to preserve whatever little mystery she had left to maintain. But what were the deeper layers? What had each woman witnessed, and what was deliberately being withheld? Poirot glanced over at the butler, Mr. Edward Lawson, a tall, impeccably dressed man who had served the Beaumont family for decades. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched a silver tray, too firmly for it to appear natural. A servant, one might think, but Poirot knew better. No one in a household of this size could avoid involvement. He had seen the way Lawson had greeted the guests earlier, his cold politeness, his sharp observations as he moved through the crowd. He had been a constant fixture, so why was it that now, when a death had occurred, he stood silent, watching from the periphery as though he were a mere bystander? Poirot moved to the center of the room and addressed the gathering of guests, his voice polite but firm. "I request that no one leaves this room until I have had the chance to speak with each of you. You are all connected to this matter, and it is only through cooperation that we will uncover the truth." There was a ripple of unease as the guests exchanged glances. Lady Margaret's lips tightened, her eyes darting toward the door, but she did not speak. Clara, too, stiffened, the air of nervous tension growing thicker by the second. Poirot observed these reactions closely, his sharp mind cataloguing each subtle movement, every inch of discomfort. "Now, I must ask each of you to remain calm as we unravel the mystery of the Duke's death," Poirot continued, his eyes scanning the faces before him, trying to decipher the truth from their expressions. "There is no place for panic. Not now. We must trust that the logic of our investigation will reveal the hidden truth." Poirot's eyes flickered across the room once again, his gaze lingering just a moment longer on each individual. One man in particular caught his attention, Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne, a politician of some repute whose sudden silence seemed out of character. He was known for his grandiose speeches, his elaborate hand gestures, and his ability to dominate any conversation. Yet now he stood at the far corner, looking remarkably pale and oddly subdued. There was no doubt in Poirot's mind that Sir Geoffrey had been involved in some way, but how? Was it his ambition that had led him to dark ends, or was there something far more personal at play? Poirot turned toward the others, each person in the room now appearing like a cog in a machine he was beginning to assemble, slowly but surely. Their motives were yet unclear, but one thing was certain. The death of the Duke was no random act. There was a deliberate hand at play here, someone who had known exactly what they were doing. Lady Margaret, Clara, Mr. Lawson, Sir Geoffrey, and the others, they were all connected to this crime, whether by proximity or motive, and Poirot knew that the key to unraveling this web lay in understanding their behavior, their interactions, and the secrets they kept hidden. The stage was set. The players were in place. It was time for Poirot to begin the methodical process of dissection. The guests had reluctantly taken their places in a circle, some seated and others standing, the once vibrant hum of the ballroom now replaced with a tense silence. Poirot's eyes flickered from one person to the next, gauging their reactions as he meticulously arranged his thoughts. He had not yet spoken of his conclusions. He was careful to withhold his judgment. It would be far too early for such things. For now, he must observe and listen. He began with Lady Margaret Thornton, who had moved to the farthest corner of the room, her posture straight, her expression composed. She looked as though she were trying to reclaim her dignity, despite the uncertainty that clearly gripped her. Poirot approached her calmly, his small, deliberate steps echoing in the silence. "Madame," Poirot began, his voice as smooth as velvet, but with an underlying firmness that demanded her attention. "It is, of course, a dreadful thing that has occurred. The Duke was a man of many connections, as I understand." Lady Margaret's eyes flickered with a hint of annoyance before she masked it with a graceful, almost too perfect smile. "Indeed, he was well known in our circles. But I am sure I do not see what my acquaintance with him has to do with his untimely demise." Poirot nodded gently, acknowledging her composure. But you see, madame, every thread in the tapestry of a person's life is vital when unraveling a mystery. Your relationship with the Duke, his visits to your estate, the events of that evening, all hold significance. Was there anything, perhaps, in the last few days that seemed unusual? Lady Margaret's eyes tightened ever so slightly, a subtle shift in her demeanor that Poirot did not miss. "Unusual? Nothing that I can think of, Monsieur Poirot. I was not particularly close to the Duke. He was often seen at social gatherings, but I rarely had reason to converse with him." Poirot's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "Yet, madame, you were one of the first to approach the body. The initial scream, yours, I presume. You did not look so indifferent to the event." Lady Margaret's lips pressed together, her face now unreadable. "I am a woman of sensibility, Monsieur Poirot. It would be impossible for anyone to remain unmoved by such a sight. It is the nature of such occurrences. We are all disturbed, are we not?" Poirot inclined his head, acknowledging her words but not fully accepting them. "Yes, indeed, we are all disturbed." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But I suspect, madame, there is something more you are not telling me." Lady Margaret met his gaze, but there was no immediate answer. Poirot turned, not waiting for her to speak further, and moved on to the next interview. Clara Williams, the Duke's niece, stood by a large window, her fingers trailing absent-mindedly along the curtains. Her face, though calm, betrayed the slightest tremor in her hands. She was young, perhaps too young for such an evening of high society, but she held herself with an air of grace that suggested she had been groomed for just this life. Still, there was something in her eyes, a subtle flicker of uncertainty, that caught Poirot's attention. "Ah, mademoiselle." Poirot greeted her softly. "How very distressing this must be for you, to have witnessed such a tragedy unfold so quickly." Clara's gaze lifted to meet his, her expression softening as she spoke. "It was horrifying. I never imagined such a thing could happen here, of all places. We were all so happy, so sure that nothing would go wrong." Poirot studied her carefully. Her words rang with sincerity, but Poirot had long since learned to trust his instincts over the words of the well-trained and polished social elite. "Indeed. But, mademoiselle, you were close to your uncle, were you not? His death must surely have affected you deeply." Clara hesitated, her eyes shifting momentarily before she answered. I did not know him as well as I would have liked. But yes, it is a terrible loss. Poirot, ever patient, allowed her to continue, watching her reactions. And what of the last few hours? Did your uncle seem preoccupied with anything? Any indication that he was expecting danger, or perhaps anyone particular? Clara's face tightened slightly, her lips parting as though she were about to speak, but then she swallowed as if the words were too heavy. Number nothing. He was himself. Charming, as always. Her words were unconvincing, though Poirot noted her shifting stance, the nervousness in her voice. The key lay in the pauses, the moments when she withheld. Poirot's lips curled into a small smile, barely perceptible. I understand, mademoiselle, but it is often in the small details that we find the truth. I will return to you later, no doubt. Without waiting for a response, Poirot turned away and moved towards Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne, who had been pacing in the corner of the room. Sir Geoffrey's face was flushed, and his hands were clasped tightly behind his back. The once gregarious politician now appeared pale and stiff, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. Poirot approached him, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "Ah, Sir Geoffrey," he said, his voice warm but probing. "I trust you are not too distressed by the events of the evening." Sir Geoffrey looked up, blinking as though emerging from a fog. "Distressed? Why, of course I am. A man is dead. The Duke was, he was an acquaintance of mine. A political ally, if you will." Poirot nodded, considering the words carefully. "Ah, an ally. A man who could be counted upon to support your endeavors." Sir Geoffrey stiffened, his jaw tightening. Yes, we had our differences, of course, but we were on friendly terms. Politics is a strange thing. Friendships and alliances shift with the winds of power. Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "Yes, indeed. And yet, Sir Geoffrey, you seem unusually agitated, more so than the others. Tell me, what was your relationship with the Duke like in recent days?" Sir Geoffrey hesitated, looking down at his shoes for a moment before meeting Poirot's gaze. There was nothing out of the ordinary. The Duke was a complicated man. There were rumors, but I had no reason to believe them. No reason at all. Poirot watched him closely. "And yet, you seem to know more about these rumors than you are letting on." Sir Geoffrey took a deep breath, his posture straightening. "I was his political rival," he admitted, his voice cold. "But I would not have wished him dead. No one could have foreseen this. No one." Poirot's eyes sparkled with a knowing glance. "Indeed, Sir Geoffrey, but sometimes the most unlikely of events are the ones that hold the clearest answers." As the interviews continued, Poirot's mind raced, each new statement, each new detail fitting into place like pieces of an intricate puzzle. The guests were more than they seemed, their motives more complex than a simple tale of political rivalry or family ties. As he surveyed the room, Poirot knew that the real answer would lie not in the overt acts or the obvious suspects, but in the human psyche. The small cracks in their facades, the betrayals hidden beneath the most well-crafted smiles. The house was thick with tension, each guest now acutely aware of the other's movements, their eyes darting furtively as Poirot continued his interviews. The ballroom, once filled with elegant chatter and social poise, had transformed into a scene of palpable unease. Lady Margaret Thornton, Clara Williams, Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne and the others were now each standing in uneasy clusters, pretending to hold their composure but failing miserably at it. Poirot, however, was methodical. He had long since dismissed the outward chaos, his mind far from the frenzied gossip and whispered fears circulating through the room. His eyes were sharp and calculating, each suspect a puzzle piece waiting to be examined. He had seen enough to know that the Duke's murder was not as simple as it seemed. Lady Margaret had been too composed, too careful in her words. Clara, while appearing innocent, had seemed on the edge of something, perhaps guilt or fear, but her reactions did not quite match her polished demeanor. And Sir Geoffrey, while still a man of considerable political stature, seemed agitated. There was something there. But in Poirot's experience, these impressions could be misleading. The key to a solution was never so straightforward. There was always more than met the eye. Poirot had been observing the suspects closely, listening to their words, but his attention had also been drawn to a subtle but potentially significant piece of evidence, a discarded pocket watch. It had been found near the Duke's body, its brass surface gleaming dully beneath the low light. The watch had stopped, its hands frozen at exactly 11:30. Poirot's trained eye noted this and understood its implication. Was it simply a detail to be passed over, or did the watch serve as a clue? The Duke's death had occurred shortly after that moment, but the watch, an object so mundane and yet so carefully designed, seemed to hold the secret to the murder. It was as if the timepiece itself was marking the exact moment of the crime, rendering its mystery tangible. The watch was carefully examined by the attending officers, though their conclusions were swift and far from thorough. They had immediately assumed that it was a meaningless artifact, a symbol of the Duke's wealth and status, with no true connection to the murder. But Poirot, as always, knew better. He had already made a note in his mind that the timing of the watch's stopping could not be ignored. A few hours later, Poirot called for the room to be gathered once again. He had noticed something else. In the midst of the chaos, an unexpected and almost misplaced certainty had come over Sir Geoffrey. His nervousness had given way to a stiff, unshakable composure. It was a strange thing to witness, as though he had rehearsed for this moment long before it had arrived. Poirot turned to the group, addressing them with his usual calm authority. "I believe we have reached the crux of the matter, my friends. We are not far from discovering the truth, though some of you are trying very hard to keep it hidden." The room fell into an even heavier silence, the weight of Poirot's words bearing down on them. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressed tightly together. Clara's posture stiffened, but she kept her gaze firmly locked with Poirot's, a faint trace of defiance in her eyes. And Sir Geoffrey's hand twitched at his pocket, the tiniest hint of panic creeping into his expression before he masked it with an air of control. Poirot continued, his voice smooth and unwavering. "It seems, however, that one of you is trying to divert my attention, attempting to lead me astray with a convenient falsehood. The answer, my friends, is closer than any of you realize." At that moment, Poirot shifted his focus onto the pocket watch. He retrieved it from the officer who had been tasked with inspecting it, carefully holding it up to the light. The watch gleamed under the chandelier, its brass case scratched and worn, but still functional. Except for the one detail, the hands had stopped at precisely 11:30. "There is something most peculiar about this watch," Poirot said quietly, his gaze fixed on the room as he let the words settle. "It stopped at exactly 11:30, but I asked myself, why? Was it a coincidence, or perhaps a deliberate act by someone who understood the significance of time?" The room fell still, the guests casting uneasy glances at one another. The watch's presence now seemed to weigh heavily in their minds. Some seemed more relaxed than others, and Poirot noticed the subtle shifts in posture, the discomfort growing, the guilt beginning to rise to the surface. This small object, insignificant to most, now held the key to the entire mystery. Poirot's gaze flickered back to Sir Geoffrey, who stood slightly apart from the others. His fingers twitched once more, this time not in nervousness, but as if he were holding back something, a confession perhaps, or the urge to act. The politician's usual bravado seemed to falter in the face of Poirot's calm but relentless scrutiny. "It is clear to me now, Sir Geoffrey," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the tension, "that this watch is more than it seems. It has not stopped by accident. It was stopped deliberately, perhaps as a signal, perhaps to mark the moment of the crime. But who would have known the exact moment the Duke was to die?" Sir Geoffrey's face paled as the accusation hung in the air, but he remained silent, his hands twitching by his side. Poirot continued to press him, his tone polite but firm. "Your movements tonight have been most peculiar. You were near the scene when the scream was heard, were you not? You were seen by several guests, but your reaction was strangely subdued. A man of your stature, Sir Geoffrey, should have responded with greater concern, but instead, you remained eerily calm." Sir Geoffrey's eyes flickered, his mask of composure slipping slightly. What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?" "I was shocked, just as anyone else would have been. How dare you—" But you see, Sir Geoffrey," Poirot interrupted smoothly, "you are mistaken. It is not merely the shock of the event that concerns me. It is the coldness of your reaction, the deliberate suppression of emotion. You were too calm, too collected. You knew something, did you not?" The politician's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his hands clenching into fists at his side. It was clear now that Poirot's words had struck a nerve, but the detective did not relent. He was prepared to push further, knowing that only through direct confrontation could he get the answers he needed. Lady Margaret stepped forward, her voice cutting through the thickening silence. "This is absurd," she declared, her tone haughty. "You cannot possibly suggest that Sir Geoffrey had anything to do with this murder. He is a man of integrity, a respected figure in our society." Poirot turned to her with a small smile. "Madame, your defense of Sir Geoffrey is most telling, but I assure you, my observations are based not on speculation, but on facts. And these facts lead me to one conclusion. Sir Geoffrey is involved in this crime. I do not yet know the full extent of his involvement, but I am certain he holds the key to the mystery." The air in the room thickened, the tension palpable as the weight of Poirot's words hung over them all. Sir Geoffrey's guilt was no longer a matter of possibility. It was a certainty, but the question remained, what role had he played, and who had helped him carry out the deed? In the midst of this shifting dynamic, Poirot observed with careful precision. The game had moved to a new stage. The false lead had been laid, and Sir Geoffrey's mask had begun to crack. The path to the truth was becoming clearer. There was no turning back now. The room had grown colder, the weight of Poirot's deductions pressing down on the assembled guests like a storm about to break. Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne stood at the center of the gathering, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, as though struggling to maintain control over his own body. Lady Margaret Thornton had returned to her seat, her posture rigid, her lips thin and unforgiving. Clara Williams, the young niece, was still, though there was a tension in her that seemed ready to snap at any moment. Poirot had set the stage, and now it was time for the game to begin in earnest. He had already made his move, having planted the seed of suspicion in Sir Geoffrey's mind, but the detective knew that the truth would not come from a simple confrontation. No. Poirot's strength lay not in brute force, but in his ability to manipulate the game, to gently nudge people into revealing themselves without them even realizing they were doing so. He was, after all, the master of psychological warfare. "Sir Geoffrey," Poirot said softly, breaking the silence, his voice calm and measured, "I wonder, do you believe the time on the watch has any significance? Do you think it was a coincidence that the hand stopped at exactly 11:30? Sir Geoffrey's eyes shifted, his shoulders stiffening. He took a step back, as if trying to put distance between himself and the question, but Poirot was relentless. No, I suppose not. But the watch, it is only a watch, isn't it? It tells the time, nothing more." Poirot's gaze sharpened. But a watch is not merely a tool for telling the time, Sir Geoffrey. It is an indicator of moments that cannot be erased. And in the case of the Duke's death, it marks the moment when all changed. What do you think that moment signifies?" Sir Geoffrey looked away, his throat tightening. Poirot saw it. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The politician had not been expecting such a pointed question. It was this kind of psychological pressure that Poirot knew would draw out the truth. Lady Margaret cleared her throat. "This is absurd. You cannot expect us to sit here and be interrogated like criminals." Poirot turned his attention to her, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Madame, I assure you, I'm not accusing anyone of being a criminal. I'm merely seeking the truth, and truth, as we know, is often hidden behind layers of deception." Lady Margaret's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You would do well to remember your place, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment the air between them felt charged. He knew what she was doing, attempting to deflect the attention from herself and onto others. But Poirot had already seen through her. She was playing a game of her own, trying to maintain control over the narrative. The trick was not to break her facade, but to gently pry it open. "Of course, Madame," Poirot said, his voice filled with an exaggerated politeness. "But you see, I must ask these questions. It is my duty. And I ask them not out of disrespect, but because the answers are buried in plain sight, masked only by the mannerisms and masks you all wear." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Lady Margaret's composure faltered just for a second. It was enough for Poirot to recognize that he had found another crack in her facade. Poirot shifted his attention to Clara, who had remained quiet since the earlier exchange. Her eyes had avoided his gaze, but now, as Poirot turned his full focus upon her, she could no longer avoid him. "Mademoiselle Clara," Poirot said gently, "I have been watching you for some time. You are quiet, too quiet. A woman who is a stranger to such a gathering should be more engaged, don't you think?" Clara stiffened, her back straightening. I'm not used to such things," she replied, her voice shaking ever so slightly. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Ah, yes, but that does not explain your reaction earlier. When I spoke of the watch, you became uncomfortable, almost as if you knew something more about it. Tell me, mademoiselle, what do you know about the Duke's death?" Clara's face drained of color, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, as though the words had failed her. Poirot's expression softened, but his mind was already calculating. He had hit a nerve, and it was clear now that Clara knew more than she was letting on. Her discomfort was more than mere unease. It was guilt. But Poirot did not push further. He would let the silence weigh on her, let her mind race, let her begin to unravel under his scrutiny. The psychological game was in full swing, and Poirot was the master player. Poirot moved toward the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the others. He could feel the room's tension build, the shifting glances, the flickering eyes. Each of them had their secrets, and it was his job to coax them out, gently unraveling the tangled threads of their deceit. It was then that Poirot decided to make his next move, one that would place all of them on edge and force them to reveal more than they intended. "Monsieur Lawson," Poirot said, addressing the butler, who had been standing silently in the corner, his hands folded neatly before him. "I wonder if you could help me with something. Earlier, I noticed a peculiar detail. You were among the first to reach the body after the scream. How did you know where to find the Duke?" The butler's face remained stoic, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered for the briefest moment, a flash of hesitation that did not go unnoticed by Poirot. I did not know, monsieur. I simply heard the commotion and rushed in." Poirot took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Lawson's. "Ah, but you were near the curtain, were you not? And how curious, monsieur, that you seemed to be the first to notice the body, even before the others. Could it be that you had some knowledge of where to look?" The butler stiffened, but his composure remained intact. "I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I had no knowledge of what was to happen." Poirot tilted his head, scrutinizing him closely. "Perhaps, but I suspect something else. You see, Monsieur Lawson, you were in the perfect position to control the scene, were you not? Your movements that night, so swift, so efficient, and yet, in all my years of investigation, I have never seen a butler so eager to attend to the needs of his guests in such a situation." The butler's lips tightened, but he remained silent. Poirot could sense that he was pushing too hard, too soon, and so he stepped back, allowing the tension to build once more. He knew that Lawson's silence, his quiet composure, was far more telling than he had first imagined. But now, Poirot had made his point. The game was no longer one of simple observation. It had become psychological warfare. He had planted seeds of doubt in their minds, manipulating their reactions, and now he had to wait. Wait for the cracks to deepen, for the truth to bleed out, whether they realized it or not. Poirot turned his attention back to the others, his eyes scanning their faces. Each one of them was now on edge, each playing their part in this deadly game. And Poirot, ever the patient strategist, knew that the final revelation would come not from force, but from the slow, inevitable breaking of their walls. The pieces were falling into place. Soon, the truth would be undeniable. The night stretched on, the silence in the room growing heavy with each passing minute. Poirot stood in the center of the gathering, his posture unwavering, but inside, his mind was whirring. He had carefully set the stage, nudged the players, and now the game was in its most delicate phase. There was something about the tension in the room that felt like the stillness before a storm, the quiet lull before a sudden, sharp revelation. He had done his part well, planting doubts, carefully scrutinizing each suspect, waiting for their reactions to reveal their secrets. Lady Margaret had been defensive but overly composed. Clara had been too quiet, and Sir Geoffrey, though flustered, was not nearly as forthcoming as he should have been. Even Mr. Lawson, the ever-dutiful butler, had not escaped Poirot's penetrating gaze. But still, something was missing. The pieces of the puzzle did not yet fit. There was a faint whisper in the back of Poirot's mind, an intuition that nagged at him, a piece of the puzzle, a momentary distraction, something that had been overlooked. He had been pushing for answers, but the true revelation had not yet come. The answers, it seemed, were just out of reach. It was then that the door to the ballroom opened with an audible creak. The heavy, ominous silence of the room was broken, and every head in the room turned toward the source of the disturbance. A woman stepped into the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Her name was Evelyn Fairford, a name that had not been mentioned in any of the earlier discussions. She was a distant relative of the Beaumont family, a quiet woman who had spent most of the evening seated alone in a corner, unnoticed by the majority of the guests. Evelyn had always been considered an outsider, someone who did not quite fit into the social circles of the aristocracy. Her presence in the room had been scarcely acknowledged, and her sudden appearance now was more of a curiosity than a cause for alarm. But Evelyn's pale face, her trembling hands, and the frantic look in her eyes immediately caught Poirot's attention. She stepped forward, her eyes darting between the guests before she spoke, her voice trembling. "It's gone," she gasped. "It's gone. The body, it's not there anymore. It's disappeared." A collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by a surge of nervous chatter. Lady Margaret's lips tightened in annoyance. Clara's hands fluttered nervously at her sides, and Sir Geoffrey stood frozen, his face pale. Poirot's gaze, however, remained calm, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "The body, Mademoiselle Fairford?" Poirot asked, his voice calm and measured despite the sudden turmoil. "You say it has disappeared?" Evelyn nodded frantically. "Yes. I went to the study to find something to calm my nerves, and when I came back, the Duke's body, it was gone. Vanished. There was no trace of it at all. The room erupted into chaos as the guests all began speaking over one another, their voices rising in confusion and disbelief. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath their feet. The mystery had already been perplexing, but now it had taken on an even darker, more bewildering turn. The body of the Duke was gone. Poirot raised a hand, his fingers gently stilling the conversation around him. "Calm yourselves, mes amis," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "We will find the answers to this new development. It is no coincidence that the body has vanished. Someone here knows exactly what has happened." He turned toward Evelyn, who stood near the door, her face a picture of distress. "Mademoiselle, when did you last see the Duke's body? Was anyone near it when you left the room?" Evelyn took a moment to compose herself, her eyes darting nervously between the guests. I left the room for only a moment. I didn't think anyone would touch it. I thought perhaps the authorities would arrive soon and we could—" "Who was in the room when you left, mademoiselle?" Poirot pressed. Evelyn's gaze moved slowly around the room, and her eyes landed on Clara Williams, who stood slightly apart from the group. I don't know for sure," Evelyn stammered, "but I saw Mademoiselle Clara standing near the curtains just before I left. I'm not sure if she was near the body, but she was acting strangely. I thought perhaps she was—" The words hung in the air, unspoken, but Poirot caught the implication. Evelyn had noticed something. And what was even more significant, Clara had been near the body, or at least near the spot where it had been. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned his attention to Clara, who now seemed to shrink under his gaze. She was no longer calm, her previously composed facade cracking with every passing second. She shifted from foot to foot, her fingers now tightly gripping the hem of her dress. "Is this true, Mademoiselle Clara?" Poirot asked, his voice now holding a thread of accusation. "Were you near the body when it disappeared?" Clara shook her head quickly, her mouth opening and closing as though she were trying to find the right words. No, I wasn't near the body. I didn't touch it. I didn't know it was gone until Evelyn said something. I don't know anything about it." Poirot, with his usual calm, watched her closely. He could sense her panic, the way her voice shook with each word, the way her hands were trembling. She was lying. Poirot knew it. There was something she wasn't telling him, and now he had to unravel it. "And yet, mademoiselle," Poirot continued, "you were near the spot where the body had been, and you say you did not notice that it was gone. Did you not find that strange?" Clara's face turned pale, and for a moment she seemed to be caught in a struggle, as though weighing whether to tell Poirot the truth or continue with her deception. But before she could speak, Lady Margaret interjected, her voice sharp and commanding. "This is absurd," Lady Margaret cried, her expression hardening. "Are we to sit here and be accused of crimes we have not committed? There is no evidence linking any of us to the Duke's disappearance. This is simply another one of Monsieur Poirot's games." Poirot turned to Lady Margaret, his eyes locking with hers. "Madame, I assure you, this is no game. This is a matter of life and death. Someone here is hiding something, and it is up to me to uncover the truth. I do not play with lives." There was a sharp intake of breath from the group as the reality of the situation set in. The body had disappeared, and with it, the answers to the crime that had already been so complicated. But Poirot's mind was working swiftly, calculating. The disappearance of the body was not an accident. It had been orchestrated perhaps to cover up a deeper secret, to silence a witness, or to prevent the discovery of the truth. And Poirot, as always, would not rest until he had exposed the mastermind behind it all. The room had descended into an eerie quiet, the sudden revelation of the missing body hanging over everyone like a thick fog. For a moment, the earlier tension seemed to dissipate, replaced with a shared sense of confusion. Everyone was looking at each other now, uncertain of who to trust. Each person seemed to have retreated into themselves, their eyes shifting nervously as they tried to make sense of the strange turn of events. Poirot, however, remained calm. His mind, ever sharp, had already begun its intricate dance, dissecting every new piece of the puzzle. The body had vanished, but Poirot knew that its disappearance wasn't random. It was a deliberate act, a move in a larger game that was still unfolding. Someone in this room had planned it, and as always, Poirot's job was to find out who. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. His piercing gaze swept the room, observing the guests in front of him. Each one, from the poised Lady Margaret Thornton to the nervous Clara Williams, seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next move. But Poirot was not one to be rushed. He knew that now was the time to sit back and let the truth slowly unfold, one carefully observed detail at a time. Poirot took a few measured steps toward the center of the room, drawing everyone's attention. "My friends," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I trust you all realize that the disappearance of the Duke's body is no accident. Someone has moved it, someone who thought they could escape the scrutiny of this investigation. But I assure you, that will not happen. This is not the end of the story, but merely a new chapter." He paused, watching their faces closely. Lady Margaret's lips tightened, Clara's eyes darted around the room, and Sir Geoffrey seemed to withdraw even further into himself. It was clear that each of them had something to hide, but none of them would openly reveal their cards just yet. Poirot's eyes moved to Evelyn Fairford, who still stood near the doorway, her face pale with distress. She had been the one to discover the missing body, and Poirot had already noted the subtle inconsistencies in her story. "Mademoiselle Fairford," he said softly, "you were the one to find the body missing, yes?" Evelyn nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was seeing things. But it was gone, just like that. No trace of it at all." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "But you did not see anyone move the body, mademoiselle?" Evelyn shook her head, her voice wavering. "No, I didn't see anyone. I was in the study for a few minutes. I just needed a moment to calm myself." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. Moment to calm yourself. But I wonder, mademoiselle, did you notice anything unusual in the study while you were there? Perhaps something out of place?" Evelyn's eyes widened, and she glanced over at the others before speaking. "Well, I did notice something odd. There was a small piece of paper on the desk in the study. It looked like it had been hastily written, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought it was just some random note." Poirot's mind immediately clicked into action. A piece of paper? This could be the key he had been looking for. He had been so focused on the physical evidence, the watch, the body, that he had failed to consider the possibility of something more intangible. A note left behind in the study could hold vital information. "May I see this note, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his voice calm, yet insistent. Evelyn hesitated for a moment before nodding. I don't have it with me. It was taken by the officers when they first arrived. I thought they might have already looked at it." Poirot's brow furrowed. He had been hoping to examine the note himself, to see if it contained anything of significance. But if it had already been taken, then he would have to rely on the authorities to turn it over. However, Poirot knew that sometimes the simplest details could slip through the cracks of an official investigation. He would have to stay vigilant. "Very well, mademoiselle," Poirot said, turning away from her. "I will have it examined at once. In the meantime, I must ask you all to remain here. No one is to leave until we uncover the truth." The tension in the room remained thick, but Poirot's next move was already in the works. He had to keep pushing, keep probing, and most importantly, keep them all in the room. He knew that the longer they stayed, the more likely it was that someone would make a mistake. An accidental slip of the tongue, a sudden movement, a nervous glance. These were the moments he was waiting for. As Poirot turned to face the rest of the group, he noted the subtle change in their expressions. They were all trying to maintain their composure, but the pressure was beginning to tell. He had pushed them to the edge, and now it was time to see who would break first. Poirot knew that the body had not been moved just to create confusion. There was a deeper motive at play here, one that involved far more than just the Duke's death. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase the evidence, to erase the very moment that could have exposed their guilt. But Poirot was patient. He would let the game unfold at its own pace. He turned back to Clara Williams, whose nervousness had grown more pronounced since the announcement of the missing body. "Mademoiselle Clara," he said softly, "I must ask you once again, where were you when Evelyn discovered the body was gone? You say you did not touch it, but were you near the curtains at any point before the body disappeared?" Clara flinched, slightly, her eyes widening as though the question had startled her. I was near the curtains, yes, but I didn't touch anything. I swear it. I couldn't have moved the body." Poirot's gaze was unwavering. "But you were near the curtains, mademoiselle, and it is no secret that the Duke's body was found behind the very curtain you were near. Tell me, mademoiselle, how is it that you did not notice the body had disappeared? Did you not think it strange that it was gone?" Clara's face contorted with a mixture of fear and frustration. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot's words had rattled her, and for a brief moment, the facade she had carefully constructed began to crumble. Poirot, ever the observer, watched as Clara's composure cracked further. He knew he had hit a nerve, but he also understood that this was not the moment to push too hard. Instead, he let the silence grow, watching as Clara's breath quickened, her gaze darting nervously around the room. The truth was right there, beneath her fear, beneath her lies. But it would take time and patience to bring it to the surface. Poirot glanced over at the others, noting their reactions. Lady Margaret's posture had become even more rigid. Sir Geoffrey's face was flushed with anxiety, and Mr. Lawson had gone so pale that it was impossible to ignore. But still none of them had spoken. Poirot took a slow breath, steadying himself. "I do not ask these questions to accuse, mademoiselle. I ask them because I know that the truth is often hidden behind the smallest of actions. And it is in those moments of hesitation, of fear, that the answers can be found." The room was silent once again, the tension palpable. Poirot's gaze swept over each of them, his mind working in overdrive. He had seen the signs, he had listened to their stories, but now he was closer than ever to the heart of the mystery. It was only a matter of time before one of them would slip, revealing the truth that had been hidden all along. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and Poirot knew that the final revelation was fast approaching. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted once more, the air growing thick with anticipation. The guests, who had once exchanged polite pleasantries and hidden their secrets behind masks of social grace, were now mere participants in a far darker game. Poirot stood at the center of the room, the orchestrator of this delicate dance, his every move calculated, his every word measured. The mystery of the Duke's death, and now the disappearance of his body, had tangled the lives of these people in ways they did not yet understand. But soon they would. He had given them time to react, time to falter, time to slip up, and now the time had come for the final act. The pieces were falling into place, and Poirot knew that the truth was so close he could almost taste it. It was in the way Clara avoided his gaze, the way Sir Geoffrey clenched his fists, the way Lady Margaret held herself too rigidly. Each of them was playing their part in the great performance, but the final curtain was about to fall. Poirot gestured for them to gather, his voice firm but composed. "I ask you all to come together. We are near the end of our search. The truth, as always, lies before us, but we must face it together." The group assembled in a loose circle, the guests looking at one another, eyes darting nervously. Evelyn Fairford, the one who had discovered the missing body, stood at the edge of the group, her face pale with anxiety. Clara Williams remained in the middle, her hands clasped tightly together, her gaze flickering from one person to another. Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne, still unable to mask his unease, stood slightly apart from the rest, his jaw clenched tight. Lady Margaret Thornton stood with her back straight, her face an impenetrable mask of calm, though Poirot knew she was not as unshaken as she appeared. Poirot surveyed them all, his mind working rapidly. There was something in the room, something intangible, but so apparent to him. A thread connecting all of them, a web that each of them had woven, consciously or not. And now, it was time to untangle it. I have asked each of you questions. Poirot began, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of authority. And in your answers, I have seen the cracks, the lies, the evasion, the truth concealed beneath your words. But now, I must ask you all to listen carefully. He paused, allowing the tension to build. He could feel the eyes of the group on him, their collective breath held. It was time for the unraveling. Let us start with you, Mademoiselle Clara. Poirot continued, his gaze fixed firmly on her. You, who are so close to the body when it disappeared, and yet you claim not to have noticed its absence until Evelyn discovered it. Do you not find that strange? That, after spending so much time near the curtains, you did not notice something so important? Clara flinched at his words, her fingers trembling slightly in her lap. She swallowed hard, her face paling further. I told you already, Monsieur Poirot. I did not move the body. I swear it. Poirot nodded slowly, acknowledging her words, but not allowing her to shift the focus. But it is not the body I'm concerned with, mademoiselle. It is your presence near it. You were there, in the very place where the Duke lay, and yet you did not notice anything amiss. You did not hear anything. Not the sound of movement, not a whisper, not even the faintest sign that someone might have come to take the body. Clara's lips trembled and she shook her head again, though her certainty seemed to waver. Number I. Poirot cut her off, his voice now laced with an almost imperceptible edge. And yet, there was something else, wasn't there? Something that you haven't mentioned. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes piercing hers. It is not the body that vanished in that moment, mademoiselle. It is your ability to tell the truth. A shudder ran through Clara, but before she could respond, Poirot turned his gaze to Lady Margaret, whose demeanor had remained as unyielding as a fortress. Madame Thornton, Poirot said, his voice now direct, you have played the part of the concerned aunt, the poised matriarch. But I wonder, what role did you play in this? What did you know of your nephew's dealings, his personal affairs? The Duke was not without enemies. His death was not the result of an unfortunate accident. His demise was deliberate. And you, madame, are no stranger to the intricacies of manipulation. You must know this. Lady Margaret's face hardened at the accusation, her lips pressing into a thin line. I have nothing to hide, Monsieur Poirot. I hardly knew the Duke beyond the social obligations. You are mistaken if you think I had any part in this. Poirot's eyes gleamed with understanding, though he did not show it outwardly. Ah, but that is the problem, madame. You are too composed, too perfect in your poise. You, who know the ways of influence and control, would never miss an opportunity to ensure that your interests are safeguarded. The Duke was a man of many dealings, and you... Poirot paused, letting his words hang in the air. You had more to gain from his death than you admit. Lady Margaret stood stiff, her gaze fixed on Poirot, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something far more human than her cold exterior had suggested. You do not know what you speak of, she said, her voice tight. But Poirot could sense it, the doubt in her words, the slight crack in her confidence. He turned his attention to Sir Geoffrey, who had been unusually quiet, his posture tense, but his lips pressed into a tight line. "And you, Sir Geoffrey," Poirot began, his voice taking on a sharper tone, "you who have so fervently denied any involvement, I ask you now, what of the note Evelyn mentioned? The one left behind in the study, a simple piece of paper. Yet I believe it holds the key to your motives. What were you hiding, Sir Geoffrey? What was written there?" Sir Geoffrey's hands clenched, and he looked away. I have no idea what you are referring to. A note? This is absurd." Poirot's gaze narrowed. "Is it, Sir Geoffrey? Because I do not believe you. That note, I believe, was a message. A warning, perhaps, or a clue to what was really at stake. The Duke's death was not merely a matter of politics. It was a matter of control. And you, Sir Geoffrey, wanted that control." A bead of sweat appeared on Sir Geoffrey's brow, and his jaw tightened. "This is preposterous," he muttered, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. "I had nothing to do with any of this." Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, Sir Geoffrey, you were a part of this. You and Lady Margaret both. But your involvement was not as clear as you would like it to be. There is more at play here. Something far deeper than either of you are willing to admit." He then turned to Mr. Lawson, who had remained silent for most of the evening. The butler's face had gone ashen, his eyes shifting uncomfortably under Poirot's gaze. "Ah, Monsieur Lawson," Poirot said, his voice now softer but with an air of finality. "You have been watching, haven't you? Quietly observing the scene, waiting for your moment to intervene. But you were the one who had access to the study, weren't you? You knew the Duke's habits, his routines, and I suspect that you knew exactly when and where the body would be found." Lawson swallowed, his throat working as if trying to contain a confession. I don't know what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice shaky. But Poirot could hear the faint tremor that revealed the truth. Poirot smiled faintly. "Oh, but I think you do, Monsieur Lawson. I think you know far more than you are willing to admit." The room fell silent again, and Poirot looked at each of them in turn, his mind working through the tangled web of lies and half-truths. He could see it now, clearer than ever. The connections, the lies, the betrayals, all converging on a single point. The truth was not far behind. It was almost time for Poirot to make his final revelation, to expose the hidden hand that had been pulling the strings all along. The game had been long and intricate, but the end was near. And Poirot, as always, would reveal it all, piece by piece, until the final moment of truth. The tension in the room was now so thick that it seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Each of the guests stood under the weight of Poirot's unyielding gaze, their every movement a potential giveaway, their faces a patchwork of anxiety, fear, and guilt. The intricate web of lies, half-truths, and contradictions had been skillfully spun, but Poirot was ready to tear it all apart. The game, as he had known from the very beginning, was nearing its end. It was time to unveil the truth. Poirot's sharp, calculating eyes moved slowly from one suspect to the next, never missing a detail. Lady Margaret Thornton stood by the window, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes steely with the composure of a woman who had lived her life carefully constructed for just such a moment. Clara Williams, once so poised and calm, now seemed to shrink under the weight of Poirot's scrutiny, her nervous glances darting from one person to the next. Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne, the ever-politician, had retreated into his shell, his lips pressed into a firm line, his hands clenched behind his back. Mr. Lawson, the ever-reliable butler, had the posture of a man who knew far too much, but had learned long ago not to show it. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. His expression remained impassive, but his mind was working furiously. The mystery had unfolded step by step, each revelation pushing them closer to the truth. The missing body. The note in the study. The subtle glances. The lies. The evasions. It was all coming together now, and Poirot knew exactly how it all connected. Mes amis, Poirot began, his voice smooth and deliberate. We have come to the final moments of our investigation. The truth, hidden in layers of deception, is now clear to me. It is time to reveal the secrets that have been buried beneath your carefully constructed facades. Lady Margaret's gaze hardened at the mention of truth, but she remained silent, her lips pressed into a tight line. Clara shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though trying to keep herself grounded. Sir Geoffrey's face was flushed, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door. But there was no escape now. Mr. Lawson, for his part, stood rigidly, his face pale and his eyes narrowed in cautious anticipation. Poirot turned his attention to Evelyn Fairford, the woman who had first discovered the missing body. "Mademoiselle Fairford," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "You are the one who discovered the body had disappeared. And yet, when I asked you about the note in the study, you were quick to distance yourself from it. You said you didn't think much of it, but I don't believe that for a second." Evelyn's face reddened as she realized Poirot was pulling her into the web of suspicion once more. I didn't think it was important," she stammered. "It was just some note. I didn't see the point of mentioning it." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, mademoiselle, but you see, everything has significance. The note you found, the one written so hastily, was a clue. It was a message, a marker left by someone who knew exactly what was happening and who needed to hide it. A message that would lead me to the heart of this crime." Evelyn blinked in confusion, but Poirot's gaze remained fixed on her, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. "You did not notice it because you were too focused on the larger scheme. But I believe that note contained the key to understanding what happened that night." Turning his attention to the group as a whole, Poirot continued, "But the note alone is not enough. No, the true answer lies in understanding the relationships between each of you. The Duke was not just a man of wealth. He was a man who was tangled in the webs of his own schemes, his own secrets. And you, all of you, were either victims or willing participants in those schemes." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over them. The air was heavy with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the occasional nervous cough or the soft shuffle of feet. Poirot could see the fear in their eyes, the way they all anticipated the moment when he would finally pull back the curtain and expose the truth. "Lady Margaret," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing slightly, "you are no stranger to power. You have spent your life manipulating the world around you, using your wealth, your influence to shape events in your favor. The Duke's death was not just an unfortunate accident. It was an opportunity. You knew, long before that night, that the Duke was a threat to your position. He was involved in matters you could not afford to have come to light." Lady Margaret's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot continued, his voice growing firmer. "And you, Mademoiselle Clara, were a part of this as well. You were caught in the web of your aunt's machinations, manipulated into playing a role that you didn't fully understand. But your actions that night, your presence near the curtains, were no accident. You were the one who first saw the opportunity to make sure the Duke's body disappeared. You saw the note, and you acted." Clara's breath hitched, and her fingers twisted together nervously. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot knew she had been the one to move the body, but the reason for her actions still eluded him. Poirot's eyes shifted to Sir Geoffrey, whose demeanor had shifted from defiance to resignation. "And you, Sir Geoffrey," Poirot said, his voice turning colder, "you were not as uninvolved as you claim to be. You had much to gain from the Duke's death, more than any of us could have imagined. You had a debt to settle, didn't you? The Duke had made promises to you, promises that you were no longer willing to let him break." Sir Geoffrey's hands clenched at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice hoarse. "The Duke was nothing to me." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, Sir Geoffrey. The Duke was everything to you. He was your ticket to power, your way to secure your future. and when he began to turn his back on you, you had no choice but to eliminate him. Sir Geoffrey remained silent, his face flushed with anger and shame. Poirot turned to the butler, Mr. Lawson, who had been standing quietly in the corner, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And you, Monsieur Lawson," Poirot continued, his tone now one of finality, "you were the one who orchestrated the scene. You moved the body, didn't you? You knew that if the authorities discovered the Duke's body too soon, they would uncover the real story. You were the one who made sure the body was hidden, to buy you all more time." Lawson's shoulders sagged as though the weight of his guilt had finally caught up with him. "I didn't want it to go this far," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I was just following orders. I thought if I helped them it would all be over and they'd leave me out of it." Poirot's gaze softened ever so slightly, but his voice remained unwavering. "You made a choice, Monsieur Lawson. A choice that brought you into the heart of this crime. And now there is no turning back." The room was still, the silence punctuated only by the soft, uneven breathing of the guests. Poirot turned to face them all, his eyes scanning each of them in turn. "The truth is now clear," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "The Duke's death was no random act of violence. It was a carefully planned and executed murder, orchestrated by those who stood to gain from it. Lady Margaret, Mademoiselle Clara, Sir Geoffrey, Monsieur Lawson. You are all connected to this crime. Your motives, your lies, your actions, all led to this moment." Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "And now, justice will be served." He turned toward the door, signaling for the officers to come in. "I will leave the rest to you," Poirot said, his voice calm and composed. "But remember, it was not the body that held the truth, it was the people who surrounded it, and now they will answer for their actions." With that, Poirot stepped back, allowing the authorities to take over. The truth had been laid bare, the curtain finally pulled back, and the mystery of the Duke's death had been solved. The game was over, and justice, as it always did under Poirot's watch, had prevailed. The silence that followed Poirot's revelation seemed to stretch on forever, as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. The faces of the gathered guests were etched with disbelief, shame, and fear, each of them realizing in that moment that they had been exposed. The complex web of deception that had entangled them all had been unraveled with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, leaving no room for doubt. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his posture calm and composed as always. His mind, however, was far from still. It had already processed the many layers of the case, layers that had hidden the truth from the outside world and even from those involved in the crime. He had seen the way they each moved through the evening, carefully managing their actions and reactions. But no matter how skilled they were at hiding their motives, the truth had a way of coming to light. Now, the truth was undeniable, and it was time for justice to take its course. Evelyn Fairford, the woman who had first uncovered the missing body, stood in the corner, her eyes darting from one person to another. Her initial panic had given way to a deep sense of guilt. She had been a pawn in the game, caught in the middle of a conspiracy far bigger than she could have imagined. She had only wanted to escape the turmoil of her life, but now she realized that in her search for solace, she had unwittingly played her part in a tragedy. Clara Williams, once so composed, was now trembling, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The guilt was written all over her face. She had been manipulated, yes, but she had also been complicit. Her silence, her reluctance to speak the truth, had allowed the plans of others to succeed. Now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. Her defiance was gone, replaced by the harsh realization that she had been both victim and perpetrator. Lady Margaret Thornton stood straighter than ever, though the faintest tremor in her hands betrayed her. She had always prided herself on being in control, on manipulating the world around her to fit her desires. But now, as Poirot's words echoed in her mind, She realized that the very control she had so carefully cultivated had crumbled. Her life, built on power and influence, had been a house of cards, and Poirot had been the one to blow it all down. Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne was still trying to hold on to his dignity, his face flushed with anger and frustration. The politician had always believed that power was his right, that the world could be shaped to his will. But now, standing in the midst of this chaos, he knew that his ambitions had led him down a path from which there would be no return. His cold, calculated exterior had cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. Mr. Lawson, the butler, had been the most subdued of them all. His silence had been his greatest defense, but now it seemed as though all the weight of his actions had come crashing down on him. His role in moving the Duke's body, in covering up the crime, had sealed his fate. He had tried to distance himself from the others, but the truth was clear. He was just as guilty as the rest. Poirot surveyed them all, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He had watched their reactions closely, listened to their words, and observed the subtle shifts in their behavior. They were all guilty, but each of them had their own reasons for the role they had played. And now it was time for them to answer for their actions. "Madame Thornton," Poirot said, his voice steady, "your actions that night were driven by self-interest, a desire to protect your own position. The Duke was a threat to your carefully constructed life, and you chose to eliminate him. You believed that you could control the outcome, but in the end, you lost control. And now, the truth has caught up with you." Lady Margaret's lips trembled as she finally spoke, her voice filled with coldness. "You do not understand, Monsieur Poirot. The Duke was a man of many faults. He was a danger to us all. He would have ruined everything. I only did what was necessary." Poirot's eyes hardened. "Necessary, madame? You chose murder as a solution. You manipulated those around you, pulling the strings of others for your own benefit. But you failed to see that your power was built on lies, and lies always fall apart in the end." Lady Margaret turned away, her face hardening, but Poirot knew that the weight of her actions was already sinking in. There would be no escape for her now. Poirot then turned to Clara. "Mademoiselle Williams, you were caught in the middle of this web, a victim of your aunt's manipulations, but you allowed yourself to be swayed, to be a part of the deception. Your silence, your unwillingness to speak the truth, made you complicit in the Duke's death. You knew, deep down, that something was wrong, but you chose to stay silent." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she fought to hold them back. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to trust." Poirot's gaze softened, though his words remained firm. "You chose to trust the wrong people, mademoiselle. In doing so, you became part of their scheme. And now you must face the consequences of your choices." Clara nodded slowly, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. She had been used, yes, but in the end, she had allowed herself to be part of something far darker than she had ever imagined. Poirot turned to Sir Geoffrey, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "And you, Sir Geoffrey, you were driven by ambition. You saw the Duke as a means to an end, a stepping stone to power. When he began to turn against you, you chose to silence him. You believed that his death would secure your future, but you failed to see that it would be your own downfall." Sir Geoffrey's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't understand. The Duke was a fool. He promised me things and he didn't deliver. I had no choice." Poirot shook his head. "You always had a choice, Sir Geoffrey. You chose the easy path, the path of manipulation and deceit. And now you must pay the price for that choice." Finally, Poirot turned to Mr. Lawson, his voice softer but no less firm. "Monsieur Lawson, you believed you could remain in the shadows, that your actions would go unnoticed. But you were wrong. You were complicit in moving the Duke's body, in covering up the crime. You may have thought you were protecting those you served, but in the end, you only sealed your own fate." Mr. Lawson's shoulders slumped. his eyes downcast. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing." Poirot's gaze softened, but his words remained firm. "You were not doing the right thing, Monsieur Lawson. You chose to protect your own position, to cover up the truth, and in doing so, you became as guilty as the rest." The room was still as Poirot finished his statement, the truth now laid bare for all to see. The Duke's death had been no accident. It had been a calculated, deliberate act, driven by greed, ambition, and a desire to maintain control. Each of the guests had played their part, whether as victims or perpetrators, and now they would all face the consequences of their actions. Poirot stepped back, allowing the authorities to take over. The guests were now under arrest, each of them bound by the law and their own guilt. They would be held accountable for their roles in the Duke's death, and justice would finally be served. As the officers began to lead the suspects away, Poirot turned to leave, his work done. But before he exited the room, he paused for a moment, his eyes sweeping over the assembled guests one last time. "Remember," he said softly, "it is not the body that reveals the truth. It is the people around it, their motives, their actions, and their lies that hold the key. And in the end, the truth always comes to light." The case had concluded, and the dust had settled. In the wake of the Duke's murder and the dramatic unraveling of secrets, Poirot found himself alone in the quiet aftermath. The ballroom, once filled with chatter and tension, now stood empty, its grand chandelier casting a muted glow over the polished floors. The echoes of the evening's chaos had faded into the corners of the room, leaving only the soft hum of Poirot's thoughts. Though the suspects were now in the hands of the authorities, Poirot remained at the center of it all, his mind tirelessly reviewing the case. The intricate layers of deception, the false leads, the subtle clues he had gathered along the way, all of them came together to form the complete picture. But even now, as the case was closed, Poirot could not shake the feeling that there was something more, some small detail that had escaped his notice. As he stood there, staring into the distance, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Hastings, his loyal friend and companion, who had stayed by Poirot's side throughout the investigation. Though Poirot often worked alone, Hastings had become an invaluable sounding board for his thoughts, his presence a reminder of the calm, logical reasoning that Poirot held dear. Hastings stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the empty space. "Well, Poirot," he said, his tone warm and filled with a hint of admiration. "Another case solved. It seems to me that you've done it again." Poirot turned toward him, his face betraying no emotion, but his eyes were thoughtful. "Yes, Hastings, the case is solved, but there is always more to consider. There are always details that one can miss or assumptions that need to be revisited." Hastings gave him a small, understanding smile. "You always say that, Poirot. But surely, after everything we've seen tonight, you know who did it. You know the truth. Surely you're not still mulling over the details?" Poirot turned back toward the grand window, his hands folded behind his back as he gazed out over the sprawling estate. "Of course, I know the truth, Hastings. The truth is as clear as the sun at noon. The Duke was murdered by those who thought they could gain from his death. The ones who conspired against him, the ones who believed they were beyond reproach, are now paying the price. The world moves on, as it always does." Hastings stepped forward, his eyes scanning Poirot's expression. "So you're content with how things turned out? No lingering doubts?" Poirot's gaze softened, and for a moment he allowed himself a small sigh. "Content, yes. But there is always more to be learned from these cases, Hastings. Every one of them is a lesson in human nature. The motives, the fears, the desires that drive people to commit such acts, they are universal. And in some ways, it is not the crime itself that interests me, but the people who commit them." Hastings nodded, sensing the depth of Poirot's thoughts. He knew his friend better than anyone else. Though Poirot was widely regarded as a brilliant detective, his greatest passion was not the solving of crimes, but the intricate study of the human condition. The behavior of those who crossed paths with him fascinated Poirot, as he believed that understanding the motivations behind people's actions was the key to uncovering the truth. "And what about them?" Hastings asked, his voice low. "The ones who did it. What happens to them now?" Poirot turned to face him, his eyes sharp but filled with a quiet compassion. "What happens to them, Hastings, is for the law to decide. The authorities will take care of the details. Justice will be served in its own way, but it is not for me to judge them beyond what is necessary to solve the case. I have done what I set out to do. I have uncovered the truth, and now it is time for them to face the consequences." Hastings smiled, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You're right, Poirot. I suppose the rest is out of our hands now." Poirot smiled slightly, a glimmer of satisfaction crossing his features. "Indeed, Hastings, the rest is out of our hands. But there is always something to learn from each case. A lesson, a glimpse into the darker sides of human nature, and that, my friend, is why I continue to do this work. Not for the glory, not for the fame, but for the understanding. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it is always illuminating." As Poirot turned to leave the ballroom, he paused at the door, his hand resting briefly on the doorknob. "The truth, Hastings, is like a curtain. It can hide things from us, but with careful observation, with patience and diligence, we can always pull it back, and when we do, the light shines on everything." Hastings walked up beside him, his hands in his pockets. "And you, Poirot, always find a way to pull back that curtain. Every time." Poirot gave him a small smile, his face softening with a rare moment of warmth. "It is my gift, Hastings, and it is my curse." With that, Poirot stepped into the hallway, his steady steps echoing in the silence of the grand estate. The investigation was over, the case closed, but Poirot knew that another would come soon enough. There was always another mystery, another puzzle waiting to be solved. And though Poirot had solved countless cases in his long career, each one still held a certain appeal, a challenge to his mind that he could never resist. As Poirot walked down the corridor, Hastings following closely behind, they both knew that Poirot's work was never truly done. The world was full of mysteries, and Poirot would continue to solve them, one by one, until the day he could no longer do so. But for now, the Duke's murder had been solved, and justice had been served. And as Poirot looked ahead, he knew that his journey, like all journeys, would never truly end. The world was full of shadows and secrets, and Poirot would continue to shine the light of truth on them, no matter where they might lead. "Shall we go to dinner, Hastings?" Poirot asked, a hint of mischief in his voice. Hastings laughed softly, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. "I think that sounds like a good idea, Poirot. You've certainly earned it." As they walked toward the dining room, Poirot's thoughts lingered on the case. But now, as he left the investigation behind, he felt a rare sense of peace. The world was still filled with mysteries, but for now, he could rest. Tomorrow would bring another case, another puzzle, and Poirot would be ready to face it, as he always was. Because for Hercule Poirot, there was always more to learn, more to discover, and the pursuit of truth would never end. And so, with the case of the Duke's death resolved, Poirot walked into the night, ready for whatever the future might bring. The days that followed the resolution of the Duke's murder were quieter than Poirot had expected. The usual buzz of activity, the constant flow of cases, and the daily hum of life had resumed, but for Poirot, the world felt oddly still. He had done his work, unraveled the intricacies of the crime, uncovered the secrets, and brought justice to the surface. But now, as the case faded into the annals of the past, Poirot found himself contemplating the deeper implications of the work he did. Though the murder had been solved and the perpetrators were in custody, the tangled web of human nature that had allowed such a tragedy to unfold still lingered in his thoughts. For Poirot, the truth was never as simple as the case itself. It was always about understanding the forces at play, the motivations that drove people to act, and the complex moral questions that arose from each action. In this case, the truth had come at the cost of lives, of trust, and of relationships that could never be repaired. As Poirot sat in his private study one evening, sipping his usual cup of tea, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The case had been a challenging one, but the answers had been found. Now, as always, Poirot's mind was already moving to the next puzzle, the next mystery. But there was something different about this particular case that lingered in his mind, a question that remained unanswered, despite the clarity of the resolution. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. "You know, Hastings," Poirot said aloud, turning to his friend who had just entered the room, "I find myself pondering something more than the case itself." Hastings, who had been standing by the door, raised an eyebrow. "Something beyond the case." "Poirot, I would have thought the Duke's murder would be enough to keep you busy for some time. You've solved it, after all." Poirot gave a small smile, a hint of weariness in his eyes. "Ah, mon ami, you misunderstand. It is not the solution that troubles me. It is the implications of the solution, the motivations of the people involved. What led them to commit such an act? What drove them to murder?" Hastings took a seat across from Poirot, his brow furrowed in thought. "You mean the people involved in the Duke's death? But surely you figured that out. It was about power, ambition, and control. They all had their reasons, even if they were selfish ones." Poirot nodded, but there was a deeper thought on his mind, one he hadn't yet shared with Hastings. Yes, that is true. But even in their ambition, even in their desire to control the Duke's fate, there was something else. A desperation, perhaps. A desperation to keep their lives intact, to hold on to their positions and their power, no matter the cost. Hastings leaned forward, sensing that Poirot's thoughts were far more complex than he had initially realized. "And do you think that's what made them cross the line? That need for control, for self-preservation?" Poirot paused for a moment, his eyes distant as he reflected on the lives that had been shattered, the choices that had led to murder. Perhaps. But it is not just the act itself that interests me, Hastings. It is the way in which each of them justified their actions. Each of them believed they were justified, that the consequences of their actions were outweighed by the benefits they hoped to gain. He paused again, his voice softening with a touch of sadness. But in the end, they all lost something, Hastings. They lost their innocence, their sense of morality, and in the case of Sir Geoffrey and Lady Margaret, they lost their humanity. Their thirst for power blinded them to the reality of what they had become. They believed they could control the outcome, but in doing so, they lost control of their own lives. Hastings sat back in his chair, mulling over Poirot's words. He had always known that Poirot was not merely a detective, but a man deeply attuned to the psychological forces that drove people to commit crimes. Poirot's keen understanding of human nature was what made him so exceptional at solving cases, but it also made him acutely aware of the complexities of the human soul. Hastings had always admired Poirot's ability to see the world with such clarity, but he also knew that this clarity came at a price. Poirot continued, his voice thoughtful. "It is easy to solve the crime, Hastings. The evidence is there, the motives are clear, and the facts speak for themselves. But what is more difficult is understanding the minds of those involved. Why do they do what they do? What drives them to betray their own principles, to forsake their morals in favor of their desires?" Hastings nodded, but he didn't quite understand. "But Poirot, isn't that the nature of crime? People break the law because they believe they can get away with it, because they think the consequences will be worth it. It's the same in every case." Poirot shook his head gently, his fingers tapping on the table as he spoke. Yes, but that is only part of the story. The real question is not why people commit crimes, but what it reveals about them. What does it tell us about their character, their values, and their worldview? We must look beyond the crime itself and consider the deeper motivations, the fears, the insecurities, and the desires that fuel such actions. He stood up, walking over to the window and gazing out at the darkening sky. You see, Hastings, the mystery is not just about the solution. It is about the journey of discovery, the understanding of why people behave the way they do, even when it leads them down a dark path. Hastings joined him at the window, looking out into the night. I see what you mean, Poirot. But do you ever wonder if some people are beyond redemption? If they're so far gone that there's no way back? Poirot looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment before his lips curved into a small smile. Ah, my friend, that is the eternal question, isn't it? Is there redemption for those who have committed unforgivable acts? Is there a way for them to find peace with themselves? Perhaps some are beyond redemption, but I believe that every person has the potential for change, for growth. It is a question of whether they are willing to confront their own actions and the consequences of those actions. He turned back to the room, his mind returning to the case once more. Perhaps it is not for us to decide who deserves redemption and who does not, but it is for us to uncover the truth, to shine a light on the darkness that hides within. And once the truth is revealed, it is up to the individual to face it, to choose their path forward. Poirot paused, his eyes distant once more, as he considered the complexities of the human soul. The Duke's murder, though solved, was just one example of the many tragedies that unfolded in the world, each one rooted in the same fundamental human flaws: greed, pride, fear, and the desire for control. But Poirot believed that by understanding these flaws, by seeking the truth, one could hope to make the world a little bit clearer, a little bit more just. Hastings watched Poirot for a long moment, sensing the weight of his words. You always say that, Poirot, that the truth is the most important thing, but sometimes the truth can be a heavy burden. Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yes, Hastings, the truth is often a heavy burden, but it is a burden I'm willing to bear, for it is the only way to truly understand the world around us. And in the end, it is the truth that sets us free, no matter how difficult it may be to face. With that, Poirot turned away from the window, his steps resolute as he walked back toward his desk. He had done his work. The case was closed, but the questions it raised would linger in his mind. For Poirot, there was always another mystery, another truth waiting to be uncovered. And no matter where that truth led, he would follow it, as always, with the same unshakable determination and unyielding commitment to justice. As he sat down at his desk and picked up his pen, Poirot's thoughts shifted once more to the future, to the endless mysteries that lay ahead. He had solved the Duke's murder, yes, but there would always be more. And as long as there were questions to answer, Poirot would continue his work, uncovering the truth one case at a time. The evening had long since fallen into silence, the hustle of the investigation now a distant memory. The case of the Duke's death, once a complex, tangled puzzle, had been neatly solved, with the threads of lies, betrayal, and ambition all unraveled. Yet, as Poirot sat alone in his study, he could not help but feel that the finality of the case left something still unspoken, a lingering question that hovered over the resolved crime. The clues had all led him to this moment. The quiet calm after the storm. Every piece had clicked into place. Lady Margaret's ambition, Sir Geoffrey's ruthless climb, Clara's misplaced trust, and the meticulous butler, Lawson, who had simply followed the orders of those who controlled the game. But even now, after the last suspect had been taken into custody and the authorities had cleared the scene, Poirot's mind worked incessantly, picking over each action, each motive, to ensure that no detail had been overlooked. A sharp knock on the door pulled Poirot from his thoughts. He straightened, composed as always, and responded with a simple, "Enter." Hastings stepped in, his face weary but filled with the quiet relief that only comes after the resolution of a troubling case. His eyes met Poirot's with a subtle recognition of what had been accomplished, but also with an unspoken question lingering between them. "Poirot," Hastings began, taking a seat across from him, "I must say, I've never seen you so contemplative after solving a case. You're usually much quicker to move on to the next one. So tell me, is there something about this case that still troubles you?" Poirot smiled faintly, a small acknowledgement of his friend's insight. He placed his hands neatly on the desk before him, his fingers steepled together as his mind sifted through the final thoughts that had been plaguing him. "Ah, Hastings, you know me too well. It is true that I have often moved on to the next case quickly. But this one is different," Poirot said softly, his eyes looking distant. "The crime, yes, it has been solved. Justice has been done, the criminals are in custody, and the law will take its course. Yet I find myself considering something deeper, something beyond the solution itself." Hastings raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, Poirot?" Poirot's gaze turned to the window, where the night had deepened into a dark, velvety silence. The stars were scattered across the sky like forgotten secrets, twinkling with a quiet intensity. "I suppose it is not the crime itself that troubles me, but the effect it has on those involved, the ones who carried out the murder, and those who were caught in the web of deceit. You see, Hastings, the criminals may face justice, but what of the human cost of their actions?" Hastings leaned forward, sensing that his friend was about to reveal something more profound than he had expected. "You think it's about more than just catching the criminal?" Yes, it is," Poirot replied, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "In every case I solve, I do not merely seek the guilty party, the one who holds the weapon, the one who commits the final act. Number what I seek, Hastings, is the truth. And the truth is never so simple. It is not just about finding the killer. It is about understanding why they killed, why they were driven to do so, and often it is about understanding what they lost along the way." Poirot paused, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk, his mind retracing the journey of the investigation. He had uncovered the truth behind the Duke's murder, the greed, the ambition, the desperate need to secure power at any cost. But beneath the surface, there were other, more personal losses. Lady Margaret, consumed by her desire for control, had lost her ability to trust. Sir Geoffrey, driven by his ambition, had lost his soul in the pursuit of power. Clara, manipulated and silenced, had lost her sense of self-worth. Lawson, the butler, had lost his sense of loyalty, having betrayed everything he once believed in. "Do you ever wonder, Hastings," Poirot continued, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts, "if the criminals themselves suffer as much as their victims? The desire for control, the fear of losing it, leads them to commit terrible acts. But in the end, they lose something more precious, something they cannot reclaim, their humanity." Hastings sat back, absorbing Poirot's words. He had always known that Poirot's ability to solve a case came not only from his sharp intellect, but also from his deep understanding of human nature. Poirot did not just see crimes as puzzles to be solved. He saw them as reflections of the flaws and weaknesses that made people human. He sought to uncover the deeper truths, the motivations that lay beneath the surface. "You're right, Poirot," Hastings said quietly. "It's easy to focus on the facts, the evidence, the who and the why. But it's the why that matters most, isn't it? Understanding why people do what they do, why they turn to such extremes. That's what gives the case its meaning." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes focused on a spot just beyond the window. "Exactly, Hastings. And in this case, the murder was not an act of a single, evil person. No, it was the result of a combination of fears, desires, and actions that were set in motion long before that fateful night. The Duke, for all his faults, was a symbol of something larger, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, of the fragility of human ambition. And in the end, it was not just the Duke who died that night. It was something within each of them, their own sense of morality, their sense of right and wrong. Poirot turned back to Hastings, his expression softening. "But as you said, Hastings, the case is over now. The criminal has been caught, and the truth has been revealed. There is nothing more for me to do but reflect on what I've learned, and as always, I'm reminded that while the truth is often uncomfortable, it is always necessary." Hastings gave a small smile, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "You've solved another case, Poirot, and once again, you've given us more than just the answer. You've given us a deeper understanding of what drives people to do the things they do." Poirot smiled in return, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. "It is the pursuit of understanding, Hastings, that keeps me going. Solving the crime is only the beginning. It is what we learn from it that matters most." With that, Poirot rose from his chair and moved toward the door. "Come, Hastings, let us take a walk. The night is calm and I have much more to reflect on. But I believe, for tonight, it is enough to simply be at peace with the world we live in." Hastings stood and followed him, grateful for the quiet companionship of his friend. As they walked together through the darkened halls of Poirot's home, the mystery of the Duke's death seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sense of quiet resolution. They had uncovered the truth, and for tonight, that was enough. Poirot's work was never truly done, but he understood that sometimes the most important thing was to let go of the case and allow the world to unfold as it would. The truth would always be there, waiting to be discovered. One mystery at a time. As they stepped into the cool night air, Poirot looked up at the stars, his mind finally at peace. And so, with a soft smile and a heart full of understanding, Hercule Poirot walked into the night, knowing that the journey of discovery would never truly end.